Welcome to the Building Codes 101 webinar presented by the International Code Council. The purpose of this webinar is to provide a general introduction to building codes, their basis, development, implementation, and enforcement. It is intended for anyone interested in learning more about the way building construction is regulated in the United States. Hopefully this short webinar will give you a sense for the often unseen world of building codes that contribute so much to the safety of buildings. We at the ICC also hope that it will give you the tools and inspiration to get involved in code development nationally or locally. This webinar is divided into two parts to make it easier to use. You can watch both parts now or come back and view them individually later. It is recommended that you view each part in order at least once, since Part 1 creates a foundation for Part 2. Part 1 will discuss building codes and model codes more generally, while Part 2 will focus specifically on ICC's codes and its code development process. This webinar will answer questions such as, what is a building code? Why do we have building codes? Who is responsible for building codes and their enforcement? What is a model code? How are model codes developed? And how do you get involved? The regulation of the built environment in the United States is unique compared to other industries and even other countries. It can be a mystery to those who have not yet actively participated in it. For those in the building industry, it's not uncommon that they may have an understanding of part of the picture in their particular location or discipline, but they might lack the big picture. This webinar will be of value both to those people in industries engaging the building industry for the first time and to longtime building industry stakeholders. While it cannot go into great detail on any one aspect, it will seek to provide the kind of overview that will make more specific resources more understandable. Plus, ICC's hope is that understanding the topic will encourage more individuals and organizations to get involved in the process of developing the next generation of building codes. What are building codes? To start at the beginning, it probably makes sense to define codes and building codes and their overall purpose. The term codes means a collection of requirements that pertain to a specific subject and regulate specific practices. So building codes are a collection of requirements pertaining to buildings. The slide provides a more formal definition. The primary application of these rules is simply to regulate new or proposed construction. Building codes set formal rules for things like the design of buildings, the way buildings are to be built, the materials to construct buildings, and the overall performance of buildings. The term building codes caused some confusion because it has come to mean the collection of codes pertaining to a building, and it also means one particular code in that group. The core family of building codes generally consists of a building code, which covers the structure itself, a plumbing code, a mechanical code, and usually electrical codes. In some places, that whole group of codes is known as the building code for that location. But there are also many other types of building codes beyond these four that we will examine later in the webinar. Why do we have building codes? The purpose of the rules and regulations in building codes focuses on health and safety. Building codes seek to protect, at a minimum, the health, safety, and general welfare of the occupants of buildings and the public in general. They address many hazards like structural failure, fire, storm, and wind damage, flooding, earthquakes, rotten decay, electrocution, dangerous fumes and gases, drinking water contamination, and much more. A key point is that building codes are the minimum requirements for a building. Building strictly to the codes and no more will not guarantee a durable, high-quality building. The codes only seek to ensure that a building is reasonably safe. Some have described it as the worst you can build a building by law. Many building owners expect and demand buildings that also have greater durability, performance, and quality than building codes alone may dictate in their minimum requirements. So for many, just building to the code may not be enough. That leads to a fundamental question. Why have building codes? Why do jurisdictions impose rules on property owners dictating what can be built on their own property? There are a number of reasons. The first is public safety. Building safety affects others beyond just the building owner. Whether it be concern for contaminating the public water supply, the safety of the general public within buildings, or the safety of the public near buildings, the way buildings are built has a big effect on many others. Building codes also ensure the provision of public services. Jurisdictions provide emergency services such as firefighting, and provisions must be made to maximize the safety of emergency personnel responding to a building. Building codes also ensure accessibility and equal access. Federal law requires that equal access be provided to buildings to allow all users reasonable access and use despite any disabilities they may have. Reasonable insurance is another important reason for building codes. In order to make insurance of property available at a reasonable rate, insurance companies rely on the use of building codes and the knowledge that a building is built to a certain appropriate standard. Another reason for building codes is the fact that buildings have a very long life. Buildings are often bought and sold several times throughout their life. New buyers need to have the assurance that a building is built safely and properly, since many of the features of an existing building are hidden and impossible to inspect. And lastly, building codes are important because of the complexity of buildings. They have become very complex structures. Even if a building owner wants to have a building built safely, they rarely have the necessary expertise to ensure that it's done properly on their own. These are just some of the reasons why a jurisdiction may impose building codes. But ultimately, the decision regarding the type and extent of building codes used in a certain area or state is determined locally, based on local needs and local values. Aside from the core benefits of protecting life, health, and safety, building codes provide many other advantages to building owners, the building industry, and to society. Building codes can provide uniformity of building practice, something that makes training easier and can lower construction costs. They can also level the playing field for contractors by ensuring that all must meet a minimum standard of construction. Building codes, of course, improve the quality of construction, and they aid in accessibility for all users of public buildings in spite of any disabilities they may have. Building codes ensure that structures have an appropriate interaction or interface with the site and with the community in which the building appears. Some examples of this are stormwater runoff, fire spread, noise, backflow prevention in water systems, and the like. Building codes can contribute to a safe working environment for construction and maintenance personnel. And lastly, building codes contribute to a sense of community well-being and quality. Plus, they can make a community a desirable location for businesses to place facilities. When do building codes apply? Primarily, building codes come into play when a building or structure is newly constructed, or for an existing building when it is remodeled, added to, or renovated. These situations usually require that a building permit be obtained, which then invokes the building codes. For new buildings, it's simple. The entire building must be built in full compliance with the building codes of that jurisdiction for that type of building. For existing buildings, it gets a bit more complicated. When additions are added to existing structures, the new construction must be built in accordance with the current building codes. Unaffected and unchanged portions of the building are generally not required to be upgraded to meet the current building code. The same is true for renovations and alterations to existing buildings. Only the affected portions of the building must be brought up to code in most circumstances. There are, however, a few circumstances which will cause existing buildings to be required to meet some code elements in some places, even though renovations aren't planned. One example is the sale of the building. Some jurisdictions have put in place requirements that items such as smoke alarms or ground fault current interrupters, or GFCI, outlets be upgraded if necessary when a structure is sold. Also, some locations have adopted property maintenance codes, such as ICC's International Property Maintenance Code, IPMC. Where adopted, it provides requirements for continued use and maintenance of plumbing, mechanical, electrical, and fire protection systems in existing residential and non-residential structures. These codes can be invoked to require upgrades and repairs even when there is no renovation or alteration that would trigger the need for a building permit. It's important to understand that local requirements may vary, and you should contact your local building department to determine the specific requirements for your location. Who is responsible for building codes? In the U.S., the answer is not always clear. But unlike many countries, building codes are not dictated for the entire country by the federal government. Instead, the states have reserved that power, since the federal government is not delegated the right to regulate the safety of buildings. This is accomplished through the 10th Amendment to the Constitution and are known as police powers. There are exceptions, though, where the federal government still plays a limited role in setting elements of national building codes. Probably the best known is manufactured housing, also known as HUD code housing. Because these units are built in a factory setting and transported throughout the country, they are required to conform to a building code set by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, to aid in interstate commerce. Other exceptions include federal requirements for accessibility in the Americans with Disabilities Act and worker safety requirements from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. The federal government also influences state policy by tying federal funding to the level of building codes adopted. The various states, in turn, approach building codes differently, as we'll see in the next slide. So who is responsible for setting building codes at the state level? Again, it varies. Even though all the states have the right to set building codes, the way they handle that right varies widely. The simplest approach is one where the state sets building code requirements that apply throughout the entire state. Some allow local jurisdictions, such as counties, cities, townships, parishes, etc., to amend the state code, while others do not permit any changes. If changes are permitted, many states also require that local jurisdictions first get approval or demonstrate that the resulting code is no less stringent than the state code. Other states use an approach which is often called home rule. Here, the authority to adopt building codes is further delegated downward to local municipalities. Some states then require that the local jurisdiction adopt a code, while others let the local jurisdiction decide whether to adopt any code at all. The restrictions and requirements placed on local governments in this case varies widely. Commonly, however, state governments will set standards to apply to state-owned or funded buildings, regardless of where they're built in the state. Next, we'll look at two examples, Florida and Arizona, to help illustrate the differences. The first example is the state of Florida, where building codes are established at the state level and local jurisdictions are required to enforce it at the local level. The Florida Building Code has been enforced statewide since 2001, driven by the need for strong building standards to ensure that buildings survive the challenges of hurricanes. In Florida, local jurisdictions in major cities are not permitted to put in place local codes that differ from the state code. There is an allowance for localities to request local variations, but that is only permitted until the next state code cycle, when they are expected to submit the change to the state code. No such variances have ever been granted. The second example, the state of Arizona, is quite different in its approach to building codes. It is a home rule state and has no state code except for hospitals and healthcare facilities. Local jurisdictions are given the right to adopt any code they wish, or none at all. The map on the slide shows counties where the International Building Code has been adopted, for example. Where colored in yellow, counties have adopted the IBC, although many of them have adopted different versions of the International Building Code. So by simply crossing county lines, different versions of the code may be encountered. The only county that has not adopted the IBC is Greenlee County. The result of this system is that building requirements can vary significantly throughout the state. However, local jurisdictions are given significant authority to modify the code to meet their local requirements and values. Who is responsible for enforcing building codes? Well, like the approach to developing and adopting them, enforcement of codes varies somewhat from state to state. Most states and major jurisdictions, however, have put in place code enforcement groups comprised of public officials. A limited number of locations contract the function of code enforcement out to private inspection companies. Code enforcement officials are usually required to undergo formal training and certification programs to ensure a high level of knowledge of the building codes and the laws of their jurisdiction. There are several types of code officials, including building code inspectors, plans examiners, and building code officials. The duties of the code officials may be given to inspectors, plan checkers, building officials, or any other authorized representative. Building code inspectors are responsible for the physical inspection of buildings to ensure that they meet all local codes. They can be certified in one or several disciplines, such as building, plumbing, mechanical, fire, zoning, and many others. Some inspectors are certified as combination inspectors, that is, qualified to inspect several elements of the building. This is more common in smaller jurisdictions where the number of available staff does not allow for specialized inspectors for each trade. Building plans examiners review plans to ensure that designs meet the requirements of the code. Approving plans before work begins saves both time and money by reducing costly design mistakes. Building code officials oversee and administer building code departments in a local jurisdiction. They supervise the work of building code inspectors, plans examiners, and other administrative or technical staff for the department. Lastly, many states also have licensing and certification requirements for various contractors to ensure that they are properly trained and competent with regard to local laws and regulations. In most locations, code officials make use of a system of permits to administer the process of ensuring compliance with the building code. Most building codes contain a section early in the document establishing when a permit must be obtained. A permit is simply defined as an application for inspections. The actual forms and specifics may vary, but obtaining a permit begins a process of plan review and inspection that varies according to the type of structure planned. The applicable code is usually the one in place when the permit is obtained. Of course, practice varies by location, but generally, even if a new code comes into force while construction is underway, the project is only required to meet the code that was in effect when the permit was pulled. Of course, that's as long as the project is completed within a specified time period. Numerous inspections may be required at various points in the construction process for the different systems. This ensures that systems are inspected before they are covered over or obscured, such as wiring or piping inside walls. Inspectors also make use of tools known generically as red tags. Historically, these red tickets were put in place by inspectors to identify code violations on a structure. Today, they may not actually be red in color, but they perform the same function. They are used to communicate areas where a structure is out of compliance with building codes and instructions for bringing them back into compliance. This may happen where there is a failure to pull a permit during a permitted construction project, or after a local disaster of some kind, such as a fire, earthquake, or flood. The final step in a permit process is usually the issuance of a certificate of occupancy. This indicates that the inspection process has been completed and the building has been found to comply with local building codes. The building owner may then legally occupy the structure. Now that we've introduced you to the basics of building codes, we'll focus on a particular kind called model building codes. To understand model building codes, it helps to get a sense for their origin. Some people are surprised to learn that building codes are not a product of modern civilization. In reality, they evolved from long in the past. In fact, the earliest known written code of law is from King Hammurabi, who ruled Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BC. It contains several specific provisions relating to building and construction. This code did not describe the proper way to construct a building, but instead it focused on the consequences of failing to build a building safely. For example, it states, if a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls in and kills its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. Certainly provides an incentive to get it right. In the Bible, Deuteronomy 22:8 gets more specific. It reads, in case you build a new house, you must also make a parapet for your roof, that you may not place blood guilt upon your house because of someone might fall from it. In colonial America, both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson encouraged the development of building codes. Today, much of the United States uses some form of building codes, many based on model building codes. In the United States, the development of codes has often been spurred by disasters of various kinds. In the 1800s, building regulations were fairly weak in the United States and often poorly enforced. Many cities grew very quickly, often with shoddy, combustible construction and often missing key safety features. A series of devastating disasters before and shortly after the turn of the century brought quick attention to the need for building regulations in many cities throughout the United States. For example, the Boston Building Code was published in 1873 following a major fire there in 1872. The same occurred in Chicago that adopted a number of building ordinances after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Poor conditions in tenement housing and events like the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire spurred the passage of the California State Tenement Housing Act in 1909. The map above highlights a number of natural disasters that resulted in calls for stronger building codes during the 20th century, including the 1942 Coconut Grove fire in Boston, Hurricane Andrew in Florida in 1992, the 1994 Northridge earthquake in California, and more recently Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The improved building codes that cropped up early in the 20th century in the United States improved the safety in many cities. Unfortunately, however, they were all locally developed and not coordinated. Plus, they were concentrated only in the major cities with the resources to produce them. Insurers, who lost huge sums of money in the great fires of the time, worked through the National Board of Fire Examiners to produce the first National Building Code in 1905. This organization was the predecessor to the modern American Insurance Association. The insurers made the National Building Code available to jurisdictions around the country who wanted to easily implement a sound code. This code was then updated every 10 years. As jurisdictions put in place and began to enforce building codes, the building official profession increased. These inspectors began meeting regionally to discuss issues relating to building safety and their trade around 1915. These meetings resulted in several regional associations of building officials. The Southern Building Code Congress International, or SBCCI, was formed in the Southeast. Building Officials and Code Administrators International, or BOCA, was predominant in the Midwest, and Pacific Coast Building Officials Conference formed in the West. The Pacific Coast Building Officials Conference later became the International Conference of Building Officials, or ICBO. In 1927, the Pacific Coast Building Officials Conference released a model building code to compete with the National Building Code, and it was known as the Uniform Building Code. The other code organizations soon began creating model codes as well. You should also note that SBCCI, BOCA, and ICBO agreed to merge in 1994 to produce the national organization now known as the International Code Council, or ICC, which was formally formed in 2003. ICC now produces a family of model building codes. So what is a model code? We can see that the patchwork of differing building codes around the country created the desire for a uniform, consistent code. It also showed that having each city develop a code individually was very repetitive and wasteful. It was a perfect example of reinventing the wheel. To respond to this, several organizations began developing model codes. These are codes developed not for a specific location, but for use nearly anywhere. They are usually developed by an organization rather than by a jurisdiction, and once created, these model codes can be adopted by a local jurisdiction for use as their building code. These model codes have no force of law until they are adopted by a given jurisdiction. Instead of writing and rewriting codes in each city or state, they allow building experts from the entire nation to be brought together to write and update a code for use throughout the country. Ideally, these model codes are developed through a public, democratic consensus process where there is transparency and protection from domination by any one group. So now let's look at the characteristics of a model code. While model codes from different code developing organizations vary somewhat in their style, approach, and layout, they generally share several common characteristics. First, they have a clear scope. The scope defines exactly when the code should apply. This includes the kind of buildings, the kind of work, and the systems covered. For example, the scope of the International Residential Code is very detailed, and it reads, "The provisions of the International Residential Code for 1 and 2 family dwellings shall apply to the construction, alteration, movement, enlargement, replacement, repair, equipment, use and occupancy, location, removal, and demolition of detached 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhomes not more than 3 stories above grade plane in height with a separate means of egress and their accessory structures. Several exceptions then follow. Second, model codes must be written in very clear and unambiguous language. They must be written in such a way that building inspectors around the country can read the language and enforce it as uniformly as possible. Third, defined terms are used. In the ICC codes, these terms are italicized, which signifies that there is an established definition for the term in the definitions chapter. This is key to establishing when certain requirements apply, but requirements should never appear within the definitions themselves. Fourth, they avoid permissive language that states what may be done. Permissive language often causes confusion about the limitations of what should or should not be done. Fifth, they reference national consensus standards. Building codes cannot establish the requirements for each and every product and practice used in building construction. For that, they reference standards produced by reputable standards developers that set the requirements for specific products such as air ducts, pipes, bolts, and things of that sort. Lastly, model building codes usually provide a version, year, or number. Model codes are usually updated on a regular cycle, and this helps jurisdictions to differentiate between versions. To provide an example, a section of code is provided from the 2009 International Plumbing Code. Section 605.6, which is shown in the slide, applies to flexible water connectors, the flexible hoses that are used to connect faucets and water closets to water supply piping. First of all, note the numbering system that's used. 605.6 falls within Section 605 for materials, joints, and connections. Section 605, in turn, is within Chapter 6, which is entitled Water Supply and Distribution. Next, note that it uses unambiguous language. It uses terms such as shall conform and shall be provided to all. It also provides a reference standard. The industry standard for these products is produced by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME, and it's referenced to ensure that the product meets basic performance requirements. ASME A112.18.6 is entitled Flexible Water Connectors, and the version referenced was produced in 2003. The 2012 International Plumbing Code later changed to update this to the newer version of the standard, which was published in 2010. The code language also makes use of a defined term, which is shown in italics. In this case, we're highlighting the term access. The definition for this term appears in Chapter 2 with all other defined terms and is provided in the slide as well. Model codes are developed with the understanding that they may not address the unique needs of every location. For that reason, local jurisdictions have the option of amending or modifying the model codes when they adopt them as the local code. While some areas make no changes to the model code, others modify them for a variety of reasons, including specific local conditions like greater earthquake or hurricane risk, local building techniques and practices, for example, adobe construction in the Southwest, locally available building materials, and to match regional labor rules and political considerations. Local amendments can add new provisions or delete provisions from the code. The local amendments plus the model code comprise the code for that specific location. Here's an example of an ordinance in Denver, Colorado, which adopts several ICC model codes. As you can see, Section 10-16 of the ordinance adopts the 2006 International Building Code plus several other codes and local amendments as the Denver Building and Fire Code. It reads, the International Building Code, International Energy Conservation Code, International Fire Code, International Fuel Gas Code, International Mechanical Code, International Plumbing Code, and the International Residential Code, all series of 2006, and all amendments thereto, and the administration of the Denver Building Code, all as filed March 13, 2008, in the City Clerk File number 08-256, are hereby adopted collectively as the Denver Building and Fire Code. So putting this information together with the building code information we covered earlier, we see that model building codes provide a mechanism for local jurisdictions to adopt, implement, and update their building codes to provide for the protection of health, safety, and the general welfare in building. There are many ways to learn more about building and model codes. I encourage you to explore the ICC website, which provides a wealth of information. ICC also offers a wide range of training courses, some on specific codes like the IBC, IRC, or IPC, and they're at different levels. Many of these are eligible for continuing education credits or CEUs. Others, like the two shown, are more general and provide basic information on codes and the legal aspects of them. Click on the link above to see the full course catalogs. You can also become a member of ICC. It's cost-effective and gives you access to a wide range of ICC resources. Members receive access to online tools, code interpretations, and discounts on books and training. But it's important to note that you do not need to be an ICC member to participate in the code development process, as you'll see in Part 2 of this presentation. Members may join a range of available councils and committees. Discipline-specific membership councils serve as a forum for information exchange and communication, as well as a feedback loop for ICC board and staff. Code action committees are discipline-specific bodies that act as a forum to deal with complex technical issues ahead of the code development process, identify emerging issues, and draft proposed code changes of importance to the membership. This concludes Part 1 of the Building Codes 101 webinar. I encourage you to view Part 2 next to learn how model codes are developed and updated by the International Code Council.